We like noisy guitars and cool pedals, the official Slowdive Twitter proclaims. As one of the all-time greats in the shoegaze scene, Slowdive has achieved legendary status as one of the key influencers of the genre. While today the group is revered among critics and shoegaze fans alike, this wasn't always the case. Welcome to Only Shoegaze, a YouTube channel dedicated to discussing and celebrating the beautiful noises of shoegaze. Today I'll be telling the story of the formative days of Slowdive, their journey to becoming shoegaze icons, and their eventual renaissance period that led to them reuniting. Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell had been friends since they were 6 years old. Growing up together in Reading, Berkshire, the duo formed their first group called the Pumpkin Fairies at their Sunday youth group. An indie pop group, Neil and Rachel recruited Mike Cottle and Adrian Sell, who played bass and drums respectively. Neil and Rachel both sang and played the guitar. The group eventually disbanded and Slowdive was formed in October of 1989. Amazingly, both Neil and Rachel had just gotten out of school following the formation of the band, when Neil was aged 19 and Rachel aged 18. Adrian from the previous group also joined Slowdive, continuing to play drums. His friend Nick Chaplin joined the group to play bass. Searching for a third guitarist that was preferably female, the group began sending out ads to recruit a fifth member of the band. They only got one response, a man by the name of Christian Seville. Previously in a band called Eternal, Christian wanted to join Slowdive so bad that he offered to wear a dress since the ad requested a female guitarist. To Christian's delight, he was accepted into the group. Slowdive now had their initial lineup. According to a 2014 interview with Asa Eisenhardt from the When the Sun Hits blog, the name Slowdive came from two different sources. One from a dream that Nick had, and the other was based off a song by Susie and the Banshees, one of Rachel's favorite groups. Slowdive began to perform their first gigs, on one occasion performing with an indie rock group called 530. It was a dream come true when they were eventually noticed by Steve Walters, a talent scout who was in the audience during one of their shows. After the show, Steven approached Christian and asked him for a recording from the group. Slowdive was signed to Creation Records soon after. It seemed that everything was coming together, but Adrian would leave the group to go to university after being a member for 6 months. Slowdive would release their eponymous EP in November of 1990. Consisting of 3 songs, the first track is also called Slowdive. It's a piece driven by a repeating distorted guitar riff along with Neil and Rachel's singing mostly in unison. With lyrics invoking the theme of freedom, the 5-minute track begins to pick up tempo during its second half. I think it's a strong first release for the group, and I enjoyed how it has a noisier sound than their future releases. The next 2 tracks are entitled Avalon 1 and 2, and they are much more instrumentally driven in nature. Both of these tracks feature the same distorted guitar riff that guides the listener through a hypnotizing and melancholic experience. While some listeners may not enjoy the repetitive nature of the 2-part piece, I personally liked the lo-fi transcendental sound that I would typically not expect from a Slowdive record. It's almost meditative in a way due to its atmospheric texture. The EP did not chart upon its release, but it did receive enthusiastic reviews from music critics. Recruiting Neil Carter as their new drummer, Slowdive would release 2 more EPs in 1991. The first one was called Morning Rise, and it was released in February of that year. Immediately upon hearing the first track on the EP, also entitled Morning Rise, it is evident that there is a much cleaner sound. There is a strange otherworldliness guitar element to this song as the guitars swirl and bend. It's definitely a precursor to a track one would hear on Souvlaki. She Calls is the second track from the EP, and it features Neil and Rachel's vocals more prominently than the debut track. This track has kind of a melancholy, almost gothic vibe to it, as the guitars drone in the background. In Losing Today, the final track on the EP, there is a feeling of despair and loneliness, like you're walking through a ghost town. The EP was the first charting record for the band as it reached number 83 on the UK singles chart. Drummer Neil left the group before the record was released, and Simon Scott took over the role as they recorded their third EP, Holding Our Breath. The 4-track EP was released in June, just 4 months after Morning Rise. Upon hearing the first track, Catch the Breeze, I think it's evident that the band had made a major step towards their signature sound. It sounds more melodic than their previous 2 EPs, prioritizing song structure over texture and atmosphere. The next track is called Golden Hair, and it's a mostly instrumental track. It moves slowly through its 4 minutes, but it does sound quite pretty. Shine is the 3rd track on the EP, And what I really enjoyed about this song is that it's really the first time we get to hear Rachel's angelic vocals stand out. We hear layers of her voice harmonizing with one another as she guides us through an ethereal world. The closing track Albatross is the most ambient sounding track on the record, sounding very dark and dissonant. I think Simon's tribal drumming really stands out in this track, which picks up the pace as soon as it enters. It's definitely not your average Slowdive song, but I admire its ambition. Holding Our Breath was Slowdive's highest charting EP yet, reaching 52 on the UK singles charts. With 3 acclaimed EPs now released, Slowdive was deemed part of the scene that celebrates itself by the British media, a phrase to describe the first wave of shoegaze groups of the early 1990s. Slowdive began touring with other groups associated with the scene. Unfortunately, just as Slowdive was beginning to find their sound and audience, the British press was becoming increasingly dismissive of shoegaze music as grunge and Britpop came into style. Despite all this, Slowdive began production on their debut album while Neil convinced the head of Creation Records that they had enough material to record one. This was actually a lie, and the group hurried into the recording studio to begin the process. They began experimenting with sound and smoking marijuana to enhance their creativity. Neil would later comment on the process, quote, "We went into a studio for 6 weeks and had no songs at the start, and at the end we had an album. Just for a Day was released in September 1991. Despite the fact that Just for a Day was rushed, it isn't a bad record. As a matter of fact, I think it's a great record, but I can't help but think just how groundbreaking this record could have been if Slowdive would have had more time to develop it. One high point on the album is the second track called Celia's Dream, as I enjoy the atmosphere created by Neil's vocals along with the glistening synths. The aforementioned Catch the Breeze from their third EP is another excellent track. Waves is a standout track with a fitting name, as while I was listening to it, I felt like I was being splashed with waves of beautiful chords. It's definitely one of the most optimistic Slowdive tracks I've ever heard. The closing track Primal serves as an epic conclusion to the album, as it builds into this beautiful sound of echoing guitar reverberation. Unfortunately, reviews were less enthusiastic about Just for a Day as they were about Slowdive's previous 3 EPs. While critics weren't hostile towards the record, they were noticeably more tepid in their response. For instance, John Ridge from Lime Lizard magazine commented that the record was, quote, "more of a continuation, or aqueous celebration rather, than an advancement." Despite middling reviews, the record was somewhat of a commercial success, reaching number 32 on the UK album charts. Following the release of Just for a Day, Slowdive embarked on a tour in the United Kingdom in late 1991, and then toured the United States with Blur. They would tour Europe in 1992 as well. In conjunction with their 1992 tours, Slowdive released Blue Day, a compilation album featuring most of the songs from their first 3 EPs. As the bandmates were preparing for the material for their second album that same year, the backlash against shoegaze music was at full force in the British press. Their music was becoming increasingly the target of criticism, especially after My Bloody Valentine released their iconic Loveless album the previous autumn. With the bandmates being in their early 20s, they were still very young and were becoming self-conscious about their songwriting and how it might be perceived. To make matters worse, they had to start recording material from scratch after the head of Creation Studios listened to 40 songs they recorded and dismissed them as shit. In order to aid them with the creative process, Slowdive sent a letter to legendary musician and record producer Brian Eno, asking him to produce their second album. Eno complimented their music, but said he would rather collaborate than produce. The sessions between Slowdive and Eno proved to be fruitful. The track Sing was co-written by Eno, and the track Here She Comes featured Eno on keyboards. Despite the contributions Eno provided, the recording sessions were complicated by the recent breakup between Neil and Rachel. Neil would go on to isolate himself in a rented cottage in Wales during the recording sessions due to his fragile emotional state. When he returned 2 weeks later, he brought with him some new songs that conveyed his feelings about his time at the cottage and his breakup with Rachel. One of these songs was called Dagger, which made it onto the album. In tough times, Neil was able to reflect the difficult emotions he was experiencing in his art.
And me, I am your dagger.
2 weeks before releasing their second studio album, Slowdive would release their EP Outside Your Room in May of 1993, which featured 2 songs that would appear on the album. It functioned as sort of a promo. Finally, despite a hostile press, unimpressed head of Creation Studio, and breakup between bandmates, Slowdive released their second studio album, Souvlaki, in June 1993. According to the album's linear notes, the bandmates decided to name their album Souvlaki after hearing a prank call by the Jerky Boys. One of the men from the comedy duo called a hotel and the following ensued. Quote, "Out of nowhere, the guy asks the manager if he'd like to my wife up the ass and I'll take pictures." Learning that the manager was Greek, he became even more excited. "My wife loves Greek shit. She'll suck your like souvlaki." End quote. Apparently, the Slowdive bandmates found this really funny and decided to name their album after the Greek dish referenced in the prank call. Though the origins of the album's name are far from appropriate, the music on the album contains some of the most insightful lyricism and gorgeous instrumentation I have ever heard. The album begins with Alison, which is a stunningly beautiful opener. Sung entirely by Neil, the lyrics seem to be telling the story of two lovers who appear to be falling into bad habits, most likely some sort of psychedelic. From the perspective of the singer, they acknowledge the feeling of sinking and feeling lost, but they continue to be thrilled by Alison, who sounds to be much more experienced. There's definitely a feeling of longing in the song, which would make sense considering the breakup that occurred behind the scenes. What I enjoy about this track and most Slowdive tracks in general is how there are clear and understandable lyrics in their songs. I think this allows the band to stand out from other shoegaze groups which tend to have overwhelming sound that drowns the vocals out. The aforementioned Brian Eno collaboration tracks Sing and Here She Comes both appeared on the album. While Souvlaki is typically referenced as a shoegaze classic, one can hear other influences on the record like ambient and drum and bass music. Some of these elements can be heard on Souvlaki's Space Station, the sixth track on the album. Then we have When the Sun Hits, which is a downright euphoric track. It begins with the now iconic guitar riff as Neil sings about an individual he calls Sweet Thing, who he pleads not to leave him. The chorus explodes into what sounds like pure ecstasy. There's a feeling of both elation and desolation in the track. Souvlaki peaked at number 51 on the UK album charts, which was 19 places lower than Just for a Day. At the time of its release, reviews of Souvlaki were mixed or even scathing. John Mulvey of NME called it pretty but unfulfilled, while Dave Simpson of Melody Maker stated, quote, "Sing aside, I would rather drown choking in a bath full of porridge than ever listen to it again." Complicating matters even further, the US release date of Souvlaki was pushed back 8 months, just after Slowdive had booked a tour with Catherine's Wheel in the nation. They would go on to record another EP called 5 EP that was released in November of 1993. Upon listening to it, it's clear that they were stepping away from shoegaze and embracing an ambient techno sound instead. They embarked on a European tour with the dream pop group called Cranes. However, Slowdive would lose Simon, who was upset by the 8-month delay release of Souvlaki. They would recruit Ian McCutcheon to replace him on drums. In 1994, Slowdive began recording their follow-up studio album to Souvlaki. Becoming increasingly interested in ambient and post-rock music, Neil composed the album in nearly all of its entirety. He began experimenting with looping and digital technologies as well. Pygmalion was released in February of 1995. There is debate to be had as to whether or not Pygmalion is a shoegaze record at all. Perhaps it could be described more as ambient pop music. I think there is something quite intimate about this record. In many ways, it is the polar opposite from Just for a Day or Souvlaki, as it dabbles with minimalism rather than overwhelming sound. Some parts of the record have no percussion at all, with rhythm being created from looping guitar riffs or Nick's bass performance. For example, the track Crazy for You features Neil repeatedly singing Crazy for Loving You over and over again with heavy reverb. There's a hypnotic quality to the 6-minute track that I enjoy. The opening track Rutti is more than 10 minutes long, but I think it makes good use of this time, building guitar textures as the percussion enters into the track. Blue Skied and Cleared has an excellent melody, and I thought it was interesting how it fluctuates between a calm and unsettling sound. Pygmalion was mostly met with indifference upon its release. With the Britpop scene at peak popularity at the time, Slowdive was now considered past their sell-by-date shoegazers. They were mocked by NME's John Harris, who called the record career suicide. Perhaps John was right, as Slowdive was dropped from Creation Records a week after the release of Pygmalion. Just like that, after 3 studio albums, 5 EPs, and several tours, Slowdive disbanded. Over the next 2 decades, the former members of Slowdive would move on to different projects. Neil, Rachel, and Ian were signed to 4AD Records in 1995 in a group called Mojave 3. They also recruited Simon Rowe and Alan Forrester, with the former being the guitarist from Chapter House. Between 1995 and 2006, Mojave 3 would release 5 studio albums, blending dream pop with alternative and country music. They disbanded in the late 2000s, only reuniting once in 2011 for a live performance. Simon would be involved in various projects following Slowdive's disbandment. He formed the group Televise and was also a member of indie band Low Gold and performed with ambient shoegaze band The Sight Below. Christian formed a band called Monster Movie, which maintained the old Slowdive sound. It seemed like Slowdive was a band of the past, a group that was overshadowed by Britpop acts like Pulp and Oasis. Reunion seemed unlikely, as the former members of Slowdive thought the music would fade into irrelevancy. However, something began to happen in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Groups like Beach House and Candy Claws began to emerge, adopting the shoegaze and dream pop sound that Slowdive had helped develop decades earlier. Over the past 10 or 15 years, it appears that there has been a new generation of shoegaze groups inspired by bands like Slowdive. It is now clear that Slowdive was criminally overlooked, rejected by the British press for not following the trendy sound of the times. Critics re-examined their music, and they have received considerable more acclaim. While Dave Simpson in the 1990s bemoans that he would rather drown in porridge than listen to souvlaki again, Zach Schoenfeld in the 21st century would praise Slowdive as, quote, the definitive shoegaze statement. As Slowdive was finally receiving some much-deserved appreciation, they were asked to regroup in 2014 to perform at the Primavera Sound Festival in Spain. They accepted and relearned their music through watching old YouTube videos of themselves and visiting sites such as Guitar Geek. At last, 19 years after disbanding, Slowdive walked out on stage in front of a cheering crowd of 25,000 people. Describing the experience, Rachel stated, quote, "We didn't realize how well loved the band had become until we took the stage there, and it was an moment. It was absolutely insane, and I still feel emotional about it and think about it." The reaction was so positive that Slowdive booked a 20-date world tour that summer. They would sign to independent record label Dead Oceans and would release their 4th self-titled album in May 2017, 22 years after Pygmalion. The record does an excellent job returning to the classic Slowdive sound, but manages to push it forward and take it in new directions. For example, the track Star Roving is a fast-paced, spacey track that gives the same euphoric feeling of one of their songs from the 1990s. Sugar the Pill has a more melancholic sound that features the harmonizing vocals of Neil and Rachel. The record was their greatest chart success yet, reaching number 16 on the UK album charts and number 50 on the US album charts. It also received critical acclaim. For instance, Dom Gourlay from Drowned Sound described the album as, quote, a majestic return that doesn't just fill in the gaps, but points unflinchingly towards future horizons. In September 2020, Slowdive announced that they are working on their 5th studio album. The future is looking bright for Slowdive, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's in store for them in 2022 and beyond. I'm Nathaniel Jordan from Only Shoegaze, and if you would like to see more shoegaze-related content, please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps out this channel quite a bit. Thank you everybody who watched the video.